Okay, Jack, how about you get us started? And just a reminder for all participants, if you're able to just keep yourself muted, except during the Q&A if asking a question, that would be much appreciated. And throughout the conversation, feel free to write a question in the chat. So without further ado, Jack, take us away.
Thanks, Zach. Hey guys, really appreciate you all joining us. As you know, the topic is whether or not Bitcoin is one of the most eco-friendly technologies. I think ever would be a good word. Is Bitcoin the most eco-friendly technology ever? I think the answer might be yes, but let me make my case. Can we get the next slide? So if you've been following crypto or blockchain, you've probably seen a headline like this. It's just become an incredibly common type of article. It's a very mainstream take at this point. Bitcoin is widely perceived to be an ecological disaster. It's destroying the planet. It's a problem. It's unreasonable. It has huge energy consumption. It consumes more than country X. And I think that it's really important that we understand the nature of this problem because, you know, Unbounded Capital, we're a firm that's putting our full support behind this technology. And so is this actually an ecological disaster or is it something different? And if it is something different, what does that mean for us going forward? We'll get the next slide. So at Unbounded Capital, we really believe that Bitcoin has the potential to change the world for the better in many ways. And we've talked about this in past webinars, in our book, all of our other content. We'll talk about it today, but definitely recommend checking out our other stuff if that is sort of a new statement for you guys. But environmental concerns, they could be the chief catalyst or possibly even a scapegoat for taking regulatory action which cripples Bitcoin's beneficial potential. You know, a lot of journalists and others have called for an end of Bitcoin because of the environmental concern. And this might be a valid environmental concern, but I think even if it wasn't, the fact that this concern is very visible, it could be used against Bitcoin because there are a lot of interests that would not like to see Bitcoin succeed, especially in some of the ways that we think it can. Now, I'm really glad to say that I truly believe that Bitcoin has immense potential to benefit the environment. And that means that its destruction would be a catastrophe, both on a human and an environmental level. Next slide, please. So my goals for the presentation today, hopefully I've already convinced you that this is an important issue. But what I really want us to take away is an understanding of proof of work and why it's irreplaceable. I want us to understand the nature of energy usage in Bitcoin. And I'm going to identify a key metric which can help us understand Bitcoin's environmental impact. And then finally, we're going to compare both the current and potential environmental impacts of a couple different versions of Bitcoin. If you're new to our webinars, there are different versions of Bitcoin. The main version that a lot of people invest in is called BTC, and we invest and are focused on the BSV ecosystem. So we'll talk about that more at the end. I'm going to do my best to make this to finish in 20 minutes, but I would say I'm an underdog. Next slide, please.
Rooting for you, Jack.
Thank you. So real quick on the framework we've used for this analysis, you know, environmental questions, they're always going to have some subjectivity. The question, is activity X worth environmental cost Y? It's really hard to answer objectively, but we're working within a framework that considers the following statements to be sort of our axioms. First is that all else equal, reducing total energy usage is good. And the other statement is that all else equal, reducing carbon emissions is good. And we're just going to take those as both true for the context of this presentation. Next slide, please. So proof of work. We're not going to get into all the nuts and bolts of proof of work today, but proof of work is the part of Bitcoin that's considered environmentally harmful. It's the part of the Bitcoin protocol that requires network operators, who are the miners, to provably expend energy in a manner that's only valuable within the context of proof of work, within the context of Bitcoin mining. So we kind of got off on the wrong foot by saying that Bitcoin miners are wasting energy, which is true in a sense because it's very important that this energy is actually only useful for the purpose of Bitcoin mining. So proof of stake is a proposed alternative to proof of work that's considered much more environmentally friendly. Instead of provably expending energy, network operators must stake cryptocurrency, so kind of like a CD account. Now, networks like Ethereum are switching to proof of stake, but I'm going to quickly make the argument that proof of work is actually necessary for a technology like Bitcoin. Next slide, please. So to understand why proof of work is necessary, we have to sort of consider what is the point of it in the context of Bitcoin. And the point of proof of work is actually highly analogous to, or it's something that's used to sort of replicate forces that affect our interactions with all businesses. Bitcoin is an open system, which means miners can come and go from the network as they please. And so it's essential for Bitcoin that users can actually trust these miners without necessarily having to care that much about who's mining at any particular time. So we have to ask ourselves, why is a business typically trustworthy? How come you can go to the store and buy a sandwich and you're pretty sure that that sandwich is not going to be poisonous, for example? So you can kind of boil it down to two things, really. First is that bad service damages the value of a business. And the second is that cheating or harming customers, it actually invites legal repercussions. So if you get served a poisoned sandwich, it's going to be bad for the reputation of that business. But perhaps more importantly, you, or if you don't survive, your family is going to be able to bring some kind of legal action against the business that served you a poisonous sandwich. So proof of work brings these same things to Bitcoin's network operators, the miners. And it does this by basically requiring, just by virtue of the protocol, investment in specialized equipment that's only really useful or only sort of can recoup its full value by mining Bitcoin. So bad service or harming Bitcoin users, it damages the resale value of the specialized equipment, which means that to be a miner means you have something to lose if you damage Bitcoin. Second, and more importantly, mining equipment actually takes a significant geographic footprint, which exposes miners to the authorities, which means that if a Bitcoin miner does something illegal, such as stealing someone's Bitcoin, which is not easy at all to do, even if you are a miner, but it means that you're exposed to the authorities. And so it makes miners much, much more trustworthy because you know that they have the sort of same incentives facing them that you would expect of a typical business. So the problem with proof of stake is that it can be done in secret. Network operators are much more likely to cheat or harm customers because they can operate in anonymity. If they can get some kind of short-term gain at the expense of users, perhaps doing something illegal, then they would be able to do this. And there's really no getting around it, unfortunately. So proof of stake, it can't replace proof of work in an open system like Bitcoin. There's other reasons why proof of work is superior as well, but we won't get into it today. Next slide, please. So if proof of work is necessary, if it's with us for the long term when we're using something like Bitcoin, then it's worth examining what's sort of the nature of its energy usage. Now, proof of work is very unique because it's largely a location-independent activity. This is very unlike most other usage of energy, which actually must occur in human population centers or must occur near human population centers. So because proof of work is location-independent, it has sort of naturally clustered just by economic forces around the world's cheapest energy sources. Most proof of work is actually done using hydropower and other renewable sources. And there have been many creative ways of harnessing previously unusable energy sources due to Bitcoin mining. So things like utilizing byproducts of like offshore oil refineries, things like that, and also using excess power generated by solar energy sources like in California. Bitcoin mining has been really fantastic because it can kind of plug in anywhere that there's an excess of energy. So as Bitcoin grows, proof of work actually has the potential to drive human settlement towards locations with energy abundance. I personally know a number of people who have started Bitcoin mining facilities in areas that are, possibly even struggling, parts of the US that have really cheap power, but don't have a lot else going for them. And this can actually help revitalize some of those areas and start driving humans towards these areas that have enormous energy abundance. In Bitcoin's unique energy utilization, the fact that it can go anywhere, I think it has already been and will continue to be a source of energy innovation. Next slide, please. So we've established that proof of work, it's necessary, and that proof of work's energy consumption has a lot of eco-friendly things sort of baked in. That being said, we still want Bitcoin to be more efficient. So more efficient Bitcoin is better than less efficient Bitcoin. So I want to point out a key metric that I think can really help us determine which version of Bitcoin or other proof of work based networks is operating in the most eco-friendly manner. So we could look at overall energy utilization, but I don't think that this is a great metric. I think a better metric would be energy cost per transaction. But really the best metric, and it's not one that we're necessarily going to be able to present to you today, but we can use it to help us understand why Bitcoin is very likely to be an eco-friendly technology. And that key metric is energy cost per transaction relative to the next best alternative. So if energy cost per transaction relative to the next best alternative is negative, which means that using Bitcoin for that transaction is a net energy savings, then the greater the overall energy utilization of Bitcoin, the greater overall energy savings will be to the world. Next slide, please. So the way we can improve this key metric is with more transactions. Transactions are the fundamental unit of Bitcoin. All activity on Bitcoin happens via transactions. So a really important thing to understand is that miners face two major energy cost sources and two major revenue sources. The cost sources are proof of work, which we've already talked about, and also transaction processing. Bitcoin miners, they're not just responsible for doing proof of work, they also have to add transactions to the Bitcoin blockchain. And in order to add a transaction, you have to make sure that it's valid. And that costs energy as well. So Bitcoin miners face two sources of revenue: new Bitcoins awarded for adding blocks to the blockchain, and transaction fees rewarded for adding transactions to the blockchain. Now, we can use the revenue available to Bitcoin miners as an upper bound on the energy used by Bitcoin. So we know that Bitcoin miners, or we can at least assume that they're rational economic actors, and they're not going to be spending more energy than they are taking in revenue. So this actually is very useful as sort of a framework to understand Bitcoin energy usage today and in the future. We can basically map transaction fees to transaction processing energy costs and map new Bitcoins to proof of work energy costs. A transaction fee is going to be roughly as expensive as it is to put that onto the blockchain from an energy standpoint. So the greater percentage of revenue that Bitcoin transaction fees make up, the more of Bitcoin's energy consumption is going to go into transaction processing rather than proof of work. So the key thing to take away from this is that if Bitcoin transactions are a net energy saver over non-Bitcoin alternatives, then as Bitcoin is used more and more in terms of more and more transactions, it becomes more and more eco-friendly. Now at Unbounded Capital, we think Bitcoin can actually replace the internet, or more specifically replace TCP/IP as the internet's fundamental protocol. And so if it can do that, then I think the environmental benefit could be absolutely massive. Next slide, please. So when most people think of Bitcoin transactions, they think about moving BTC from one account to another. But Bitcoin transactions are actually totally flexible, and they can be utilized in any use case. There's a number of reasons why you would want to utilize Bitcoin transactions. We'll talk about some today. We've talked about a lot of others in other content that we've created. Now, we should recognize that our economy is incredibly transaction oriented. It's not just payments, but also asset transfers, database operations. Those would include things like reservations and social media posts, enterprise resource planning, and much, much more. Now, ICT, which is information communications technology, consumes around 5 to 10% of global electricity, and that number is growing. So the internet and connected devices they're already using energy that's 20 times greater than 2021 Bitcoin estimates. And those estimates are by far Bitcoin's all-time high for a year. So if Bitcoin can reduce the energy cost of these transactions that populate the internet, its environmental benefit could be absolutely massive. So why are Bitcoin transactions more efficient? Bitcoin gets a lot of publicity for being decentralized, but we actually think that a big part of the value of Bitcoin comes from its centralization, specifically the fact that it centralizes information. So a Bitcoin transaction can be incredibly cheap and is incredibly cheap on some versions of Bitcoin because it only needs to happen in one place and very little info is needed, and that info is actually readily available. So in order to send Bitcoin, all the info you need is on the Bitcoin blockchain, and it's organized so that it's very easy to access the information you need and validate a transaction. You could compare that to something like Swift, where a Swift transaction is extremely expensive because you have many different parties that actually must coordinate independently, and they each have their own records, which they have to use to try and understand if a transaction is valid or not and make the appropriate updates. So this centralization of information, it extends beyond payments. It allows Bitcoin to be one record for many applications. So sort of an intuitive way of understanding this is to think about how many accounts that you have. Every time you go to a new website, it seems you have to make a new account. And with Bitcoin, I would argue that you really only need one account. And that might seem like not a very big deal, but each time you create an account and each time you're managing an account, that costs energy. There are real transaction processing costs associated with that activity. And possibly a much bigger source of energy usage would be things like supply chain actors that also benefit from the centralization of information by being able to coordinate around one shared source of truth. We know there's a lot of inefficiency in supply chains because of coordination costs, but that also, there's an energy cost there as well because you have lots of different companies that have to process the same transactions and store the same information, which also requires energy. Now, Bitcoin, I think in the future, really can start to be a net energy reducer due to its economies of scale. So I think Bitcoin's future is to be the one transaction processing system for the world. Now, currently, every single business in the world is engaged in their own transaction processing. There's not much room for specialization. Everyone's just kind of scraping by. It's a big cost for all businesses. And because of this, there's just really not economies of scale. With Bitcoin, you have an open system of competitors who are competing to process transactions as efficiently as possible. And they can accept transactions from across the world. So I think as Bitcoin continues to be utilized, it already is extremely efficient, and it's very likely to continue to become more and more efficient because it can benefit from the economies of scale of being able to process transactions for the entire world. And this really is all unlocked because Bitcoin is secure. Bitcoin is built with security at the foundation, which means that one, you're not wasting energy by adding in security later or cleaning up from security failures. But even more importantly, that security allows people to outsource things to Bitcoin, things like transactions, like we've already talked about, but also other forms of computation, which there are businesses in Bitcoin today, namely nChain, that are developing all types of ways of leveraging the distributed computation that Bitcoin makes available. And so the future of the internet, I think, is going to be much more efficient because you're going to be able to delegate much more work to parties that are benefiting enormously from economies of scale. Next slide, please. All right. The case we've made for why Bitcoin can be the most eco-friendly technology in the world is really not possible in the mainstream version of Bitcoin because of its goals. So BTC, which is the mainstream version, its goal is to be an uncensorable, unseizable digital gold. This is in contrast to Bitcoin SV, which is the version we support. BSV's goal is to replace the internet with a more secure, efficient system. And this is reflected in the current metrics for these networks. BTC's transaction capacity, it's currently capped at 1 megabyte, or around 3 transactions per second. So being able to add transactions is how Bitcoin becomes more eco-friendly. then it's going to be very difficult for BTC to improve. BTC's price is currently 55,000, and the transaction fees are $10. And we can use these metrics to come up with sort of an upper bound on the total energy cost of a BTC transaction, which is $181. So very, very expensive, even relative to highly inefficient systems like Swift. BSV, on the other hand, we've already said, BSV's goal is to replace the internet with a more secure and efficient system. Its transaction capacity, accordingly, is uncapped. We recently, just last week, mined a 638 megabyte world record block. We've achieved 3,000 transactions per second on mainnet, and we're on the fast track towards millions of transactions per second. And the total transaction capacity, it's really theoretically unbounded. We can use the same metrics, and for what it's worth, I'm using a fairly favorable block to calculate BSV, but that's okay. The price is $193, and the transaction fees are around 1/100th of a cent per transaction. And that means the overall cost per transaction is already just around 1 cent. And as the transaction volume grows, we would expect this to continue to approach 1/100th of a cent per transaction, and potentially even fall below that, because transaction fees on BSV have been declining over time. Last slide, please. All right, to wrap things up, I want to sort of present a little bit of a disturbing takeaway here, which is that BTC could really thwart Bitcoin's potential as BSV. BTC advocates, they may argue that sound money in the form of digital gold is worth the environmental cost. And like we said at the beginning, it's really hard to objectively argue whether the use of energy is worth the benefit. But at Unbounded Capital, we believe that BSV can achieve this digital gold use case and so much more in a manner that's clearly an environmental positive. So we think from the standpoint of being eco-friendly, BSV makes a much stronger case for Bitcoin than BTC can. Now, because of headlines like we saw on slide 1, very reasonable environmental concerns about BTC could actually result in the destruction of Bitcoin. And at Unbounded Capital, we're laser focused on investing and supporting the BSV ecosystem with the goal of accelerating the progress of Bitcoin as BSV so that the world can more quickly see Bitcoin's potential to benefit the economy and the environment. And I really appreciate all of you being here. And I think it's really important that we have a larger group of people who can make this case for Bitcoin and its potential to be a net benefit to the world, both ecologically and economically. Thank you very much.